The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was a turning point in the Second World War. The Japanese aimed to prevent the United States from interfering with their planned military conquests in the Pacific. However, they only provided America with the motivation to finally join the war. The 1970 film Tora 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 depicted the attack on Pearl Harbor and even included this famous line delivered by Isoroku Yamamoto: "I fear all we've done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Although evidence strongly suggests that this quote was fictitious and spawned from the film, it perfectly captures how Japan's plan would ultimately backfire. In the aftermath of the attack, 2 American heroes would fight to decode Japanese codes, with a third using this information to carry out military strikes against the naval forces of Japan. This is the story of Edwin T. Layton, Joseph Rochefort, and Chester Nimitz. Edwin Thomas Layton was born on April 7, 1903 in Nauvoo, Illinois, to George E. Layton and his wife Mary C. Layton. Not much is known about his early life, but we do know that he graduated high school in 1920 and immediately went to the U.S. Navy Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, where his joviality and sense of humor were noted by his fellow midshipmen. He was commissioned as ensign in 1924 and spent the next 5 years with the Pacific Fleet aboard the USS West Virginia and the USS Chase. In June 1929, Layton was sent to Japan to be part of the Office of the U.S. Naval Attaché at the American Embassy in Tokyo. It was on this trip to Japan that he would meet Joseph J. Rochefort, who will be key in saving Layton's career later on. It was also during this time that Layton met with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who would later orchestrate the attack on Pearl Harbor. Starting in the 1930s, Layton was assigned to several deployments, from 2 tours of duty at the Naval's Department Office of Naval Intelligence, once in 1933 and again from 1936 to 37, to 3 years aboard the battleship Pennsylvania. He was then sent to Tokyo once again in 1937, where he was Assistant Naval Attaché to the American Embassy. That was followed by 1 year of duty as commanding officer of the USS Boggs. Exactly 1 year to the day before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Layton became Combat Intelligence Officer on the staff of Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet. Layton was in charge of all intelligence in the Pacific Ocean area. Layton suspected the Japanese would attack a U.S. target based on the fact that the Japanese had left port at Kasatka. Despite this, Layton could not determine the specific target that would be attacked. All that he knew for certain was that the Japanese were going to attack a target in the Pacific, so he advised that every base in the Pacific be alerted. His advice, however, fell on deaf ears, mostly because the majority of the Navy thought peace talks would work. However, there were some, like Admiral William F. Halsey and Admiral Harold Stark, who knew otherwise. Layton's fears would prove to be correct on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. In Layton's book, And I Was There, Layton put the blame for Pearl Harbor not on himself, but on Admiral Richard K. Turner. Layton argued that Turner's monopolization of naval intelligence in Washington could have alerted Kimmel and his staff to the imminence of the attack and to the fact that Pearl Harbor could be a target. But in the end, Admiral Kimmel received most of the blame and was relieved of command. His replacement would make one of the best choices in naval history, to let Layton keep his job. Chester Nimitz, a German Texan, was born the son of Anna Josephine and Chester Bernard Nimitz on February 24, 1885, in Fredericksburg. He was born in his grandfather's hotel, which is now the Admiral Nimitz State Historic Site. Nimitz's frail, rheumatic father had died 6 months earlier on August 14, 1884. In 1890, Anna married William Nimitz, Chester's brother. Chester was significantly influenced by his German-born parental grandfather, Charles Henry Nimitz, a former seaman in the German Merchant Marine. Charles taught Chester that the sea, like life itself, is a stern taskmaster. The best way to get along with either is to learn all you can, then do your best and don't worry, especially about things over which you have no control. Nimitz graduated with distinction from the U.S. Naval Academy on January 30th, 1905, 7th in a class of 114. He lost part of one finger in an accident with a diesel engine, saving the rest of it only when the machine jammed against his Annapolis ring. On April 9th, 1913, Chester Nimitz married Catherine Vance Freeman. They would go on to have 4 children: Catherine Kate Vance, Chester Chet William Jr., Anna Nancy Elizabeth, and Mary Manson. 10 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral Nimitz was selected by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to be the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet. Nimitz immediately departed Washington for Hawaii and took command in a ceremony on the top deck of the submarine Grayling. He was promoted to the rank of Admiral effective December 31, 1941, upon assuming command. The change of command ceremony would normally have taken aboard a battleship, but every battleship in Pearl Harbor had either sunk or was damaged during the attacks. Assuming command at the most critical period of the war in the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz organized his forces to halt the Japanese advance, despite the shortage of ships, planes, and supplies. He had a significant advantage in that the United States had cracked the Japanese diplomatic naval code and had made progress on the naval code JN-25. The Japanese had kept radio silence before the attack on Pearl Harbor, but now, events were moving so rapidly that they had to rely on coded radio messages that they did not realize were being read in Hawaii. This was all due to Layton and Rochefort. The road to redemption began when Layton was tasked by Nimitz to determine if it was safe to launch an attack on Japanese-held garrisons of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. After Layton confirmed it was safe to do so, the attacks were carried out by carriers Enterprise and Yorktown along with the carriers and destroyers of their task forces. This attack, along with the Doolittle raid, only emphasized to Layton's nemesis, Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, his ambition to destroy the U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers. In order to gain support for the plan to attack Midway, Yamamoto made a rare agreement with the General of the Japanese Army and Prime Minister of Japan, Hideki Chojo. Even before the war with America had started, there was a long feud between the Japanese Army and Navy. In order to appease Tojo, Yamamoto suggested they attack Port Moresby in southern New Guinea. This invasion would have been successful if Layton, Rochefort, and the codebreakers of the Pacific Fleet had broken their code. Unknown to the Japanese, the U.S. Navy had enjoyed some success with penetrating Japanese communication ciphers and codes for several years. By March of 1942, the U.S. was able to decipher up to 15% of the IJN's ROW or Naval Codebook decode, which was used by the IJN for approximately half of its communications. By the end of April, the U.S. was reading up to 85% of the signals broadcasted in the RO code. Codebreakers, led by Rochefort, determined that the Japanese target was in the Coral Sea. Layton's job was to convince Nimitz that Rochefort was right. Layton was successful, and the resulting battle, the Battle of the Coral Sea, cost the U.S. the Lexington and damaged the Yorktown. On the other hand, the Japanese lost the light carrier Selhoho. Due to the loss at Coral Sea, the Japanese planned invasion of Port Moresby had to be called off. But Layton and Rochefort's enemies were not just in Japan, they were also in Washington, D.C. Shortly after the Battle of the Coral Sea, Layton and Rochefort were fighting with their superiors in Washington just as much as they were with the Japanese. The codebreaker in Washington believed that the next Japanese target would be in either Alaska, which at the time was still a U.S. territory, not a state, or an invasion of the West Coast. Both Washington and the Pacific fleets knew the Japanese were going to attack a target called AF, but it wasn't known for sure what AF was. Rochefort and Layton both believed AF meant the Japanese wanted Midway. In order to prove their theory, they used their knowledge of the Japanese code to send a fake-coded message claiming Midway had a water shortage. Within 24 hours, the Japanese sent a coded message that confirmed AF was Midway. With this information, Nimitz sent his 3 remaining carriers, Yorktown, which was repaired within 72 hours, Enterprise, and Hornet to Waypoint northwest of Midway. The resulting battle cost the Japanese all 4 of their carriers, including Akaga, which was the flagship of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway also brought an abrupt end to Japanese expansion. Edwin T. Layton would stay by Nimitz's side until the end of the war. Later, he would serve as an intelligence officer during the Korean War. Layton retired from the Navy in 1959, then spent the next 4 years working for the Northrop Corporation in Tokyo, Japan. Layton retired from Northrop in 1964, then moved to Carmel, California. He would live here for the rest of his life. Layton suffered a stroke on his 81st birthday in 1984. He would pass away 5 days later. His cremated remains were scattered at sea. The year after his death, Layton's book, And I Was There, Pearl Harbor and Midway, Breaking the Secrets, was published. The book was written by Layton with co-authors Roger Pineau and John Costello. Layton's wife, Miriam, helped with the book's publication by granting Pineau and Costello access to Layton's notes after his death. Joseph Rochefort had a more disappointing fate. After the Battle of Midway, he was relieved of command by Washington and was sent to work on a floating dock in San Francisco. He never went to sea again. Rochefort died on July 20th, 1976. For decades, Rochefort didn't get any credit for his work, as it was believed he didn't do enough to deserve the credit. It wasn't until 1986 when he was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. On September 2nd, 1945, Admiral Nimitz would lead his ships into Tokyo Bay. The purpose of the trip was to sign the Japanese Instrument of Surrender, bringing an end to the war. The surrender took place aboard the USS Missouri and was signed by representatives of 10 nations, with Nimitz signing on behalf of America. Chester Nimitz was promoted to Fleet Admiral on December 12, 1944, making him one of only 4 people in the world with the rank. President Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed Nimitz to the rank the next day. Nimitz took the oath of office on December 19th. Nimitz died on February 20th, 1966. His funeral was held 4 days later on what would have been his 81st birthday. He was laid to rest next to his wife at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno. On June 22, 1968, CVN-68 was laid down. Construction would last nearly 4 years, and the ship would be named USS Nimitz in honor of Chester Nimitz. The USS Nimitz would go on to be the lead ship of the Nimitz-class carriers, which would be the largest aircraft carriers at the time. As for Isoko Yamamoto, he didn't survive the war. Yamamoto was planning on doing an inspection tour of the Solomon Islands in New Guinea. News of the tour was intercepted by the US, and Operation Vengeance was born. Operation Vengeance was specifically designed to kill Yamamoto as payback for the attack on Pearl Harbor. The US planned to intercept Yamamoto's flight during the tour and was carried out on April 18, 1943. A team of 18 P-38s intercepted Yamamoto's tour escort. After a firefight, Yamamoto's plane was shot down and Yamamoto was killed. The crash site was located the next day. Yamamoto's death lowered Japanese morale while raising Allied forces' morale. The story of Midway would later be depicted in the 1976 film Midway, with a remake hitting big screens in 2019. Rochefort and Nimitz were portrayed in both films. Rochefort by Hal Halbrook in 1976 and Brennan Brown in 2019, and Nimitz by Henry Fonda in 1976 and Woody Harrelson in 2019. Layton would be portrayed in the 2019 remake by Patrick Wilson, but Charlton Heston's character in the 1976 movie was merely inspired by Layton. Japan had no idea what they were awakening when they attacked Pearl Harbor. They simply wished to keep America from intervening in the war, but the attack resulted in the very thing Japan wished to prevent. The code-breaking skills of Layton and Rochefort allowed Nimitz to deliver blows against the Japanese Navy, giving America the upper hand in the war. The war would come to an end with the use of nuclear weapons against Japan, the first and only time nuclear warfare has been used. 80 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor and 76 years after the end of World War II, the actions of Layton, Rochefort, and Nimitz are still important. The world we live in today may not be possible if it weren't for these 3 men.